G'day guys, welcome back to Geek and Camo. I'm your host Craig, and today we are covering off on Lioness Season 2, Episode 3, No Sorrow Like the Survivor. Whoa, wow. So, after the way that Episode 1 finished, I was expecting Episode 2 to deal with the fallout from the attack on Joe's house. What I wasn't expecting was for the episode to immediately take us back to that 6-month forward timeline and show us more of what happens to Joe after she is kidnapped. And I think that entire opening changes the entire mystery, because whoever eventually takes Joe doesn't just kill her. It definitely wasn't that. All right, they take her alive. They keep her alive and they interrogate her. So straight away, that tells us something really important. Joe isn't just a target. She has value to whoever is behind this. And I think that is going to become one of the biggest questions of this season. So what does Joe know? What does she have access to? Or maybe even more importantly, what do they need her to do? But first, obviously, this is going to contain full spoilers for Lioness Season 3, Episode 2. So if you haven't watched No Sorrow Like the Survivor yet, go and watch it and then come back. All right, let's get into it. Okay, we pick up again in that future timeline, 6 months later, where Joe has been taken. And now we actually get to see what captivity looks like for her. All right, it's clinical, it's very degrading, and it's deliberately uncomfortable for not only Joe, but us as the people watching it. So what really stood out for me is how different this Joe is from the character we normally see. Joe's usually the person controlling the situation. She controls the operation, she controls the briefing, she controls the assets, she controls the room, and here, well, she controls absolutely nothing. Nothing at all. And that is a very unusual position for her. But from a story point of view, the most important thing is still the fact that she is alive. All right, still very much alive at this point. So if somebody simply wanted revenge for the Ukraine, killing Joe would be much, much easier. They wouldn't even have to have taken her. All right, instead, somebody has gone to a massive amount of effort. They've identified her, they've tracked her, they've learned her routine, and they've organized a coordinated abduction on American soil. All right, they've taken her alive, and now, they're questioning her. Although that hasn't really started yet. They're moving her from safe house to safe house. All right, that tells me that this isn't just revenge. All right, there's an objective here. And whatever that objective is, they need Joe for it. Okay, then we jump back 6 months. Joe has just killed the 2 men who forced their way into the house. And now we see the response. The QRF starts sweeping the neighborhood. And I really like this sequence because it takes the kind of tactical behavior we normally see overseas and it suddenly drops it into the suburban America. You've got operators moving through yards, checking rooftops, looking through neighborhood properties, using thermal and night vision and trying to work out who else may have been watching Joe's house. And meanwhile, this is all happening around normal families and suburban homes. That contrast works really, really well. All right, because it shows us just how badly Joe's professional world has now spilled into her private life. And importantly, they don't treat the 2 men at the door as an isolated event. All right, they assume that there could be more people involved. There could be support, surveillance, lookouts, maybe even another assault element. All right, and that's exactly how I think we should be looking at it. Now, this wasn't 2 random guys knocking on Joe's door. This was an organized intelligence operation. Although, not a very good one. As the sweep continues, it becomes pretty clear that there was more going on around Joe's house than just the 2 attackers. And that immediately raises another question. How long had they been watching? All right, because if somebody knew Joe's address, and they knew when she came home, and they knew Neil and the girls were there, and had enough people in the area to support the attack, then Joe may have just been compromised well before she even realized it. And this is where I started thinking back to the opening kidnapping again. Maybe that first attack wasn't supposed to succeed. Maybe it was a test. All right, so I'll come back to that in the theory section later because episode 2 actually makes me more convinced of it. Obviously, Neil and the girls, they can't stay in the house. They have to be moved. And this is where the consequences really start hitting home. Because think about what Neil has experienced in the space of a few hours. Joe's come home from another overseas operation. 2 armed men force their way into the house, and then Joe kills them. All right, now armed CIA personnel are crawling through the neighborhood. All right, and suddenly his children have to be taken somewhere else because nobody knows whether they're safe. All right, that's a huge escalation from what Neil is used to. All right, Neil has always been the person on the outside of Joe's work. All right, he knows what she does. He knows it's dangerous. But there's a big difference between knowing your wife works in covert operations and finding a dead foreign operative inside your own house or on the front lawn. Joe's job isn't somewhere else anymore. It's in Neil's house, it's in his living room, and it's affecting his daughters. And I think that's going to be a major part of the season. The episode then starts working backwards, and this is where the intelligence side becomes really interesting, because everybody has to ask the obvious question: how did they find Joe? And the most obvious recent event is the operation in Ukraine. Like, can it really be anything else? All right, look at the chain of events. Alexandra approaches the Americans, that Ukrainian-Russian chick that they saw at the university campus there. All right, she offers them Yurimov. The CIA takes the intelligence, and Joe personally enters Ukraine because she's needed to identify him. They capture Yurimov alive. Joe returns home, and almost immediately people know exactly who she is and where she lives. All right, that is a massive coincidence. Or is it? Maybe it really is just the Russians identifying the woman who took one of their senior operatives. But I don't think it's that straightforward. Because what if the entire operation was designed to reveal whoever came for Yurimov? What if Joe wasn't just identifying the target? What if Joe was the real target being identified? Think about that one. That's the part that I keep coming back to. All right, Yurimov may have been bait. So I said after episode 1 that I wasn't convinced that Yurimov was genuinely caught off guard. Is that actually the real Yurimov? And after episode 2, I'm even less convinced. We're told this guy is one of Russia's most important covert operators. He's experienced, connected, protected, and somehow an intelligence source appears and hands the CIA his location on a silver platter. The Americans go in, they grab him, they remove the tracker from his arm, and bring him out alive. It was a pretty seamless operation, really. Maybe it really was just a good operation, but what if they were supposed to capture him? What if Yurimov was the bait? Because if you want to identify people running covert American operations, one way of doing it would be to offer them a target that they simply cannot ignore. And look who eventually has to physically enter the battlefield: Joe. If somebody wanted to put a face to Joe McNamara, mission accomplished. Yeah, they've done it. All right, I'm still thinking about that tracker from episode 1. One that they took out from underneath Yurimov's arm. Maybe it was simply there so the Russians could monitor Yurimov. All right, that makes perfect sense. But what if it had another purpose? What if whoever controlled Yurimov expected him to be taken? Maybe they wanted him to be taken. Even though Cody removes the tracker, the operation itself may already have achieved what it was meant to achieve. Identify the American team, watch how they respond, see who they bring, and potentially map out some of the people involved. Again, this all feels like there are layers we haven't seen yet. All right, so this takes us to Byron and the Russians. Then we get the meeting between Byron and the Russians at that restaurant. And I really liked this scene. All right, there's no gunfight, no tactical team, no explosions. It's basically people sitting down and threatening each other politely. There's no yelling, there's no screaming. It gets a little bit heated. But, and sometimes those scenes are more interesting than the action, right? Because nobody can just come out and say, we know what you did and we're going to retaliate, all right? Everything has to be implied. Although Byron kind of really tells them, they're fucked, essentially. All right, everybody knows what everybody else is talking about, but they still maintain that diplomatic distance. And Byron, he makes it very clear that if Russia is responsible for what happened at Joe's house, there will be consequences. And I really don't think that they're going to like those consequences. But here's the problem. What if Russia isn't directly responsible? Or at least, what if the people Byron is talking to aren't responsible? Because we're dealing with intelligence services, competing factions, double agents, private objectives, and people who spend their entire careers making one country believe another country did something. So I don't think that we can automatically say Russians attacked Joe, therefore Moscow ordered it. It just doesn't work that way. It may turn out to be that simple, but I doubt it. Alexandra. That brings me back to her. She's still probably the character I'm most suspicious of. Not necessarily because I think she's secretly a straightforward Russian agent. I actually think that would be too easy. She's Ukrainian intelligence. She has supposedly penetrated the Russian SVR, and she has access to Yurimov. And now she's communicating with the Americans. So think about that position she occupies. She potentially sits between Ukraine, Russia, and the United States. That gives her a huge amount of power if she can control what information moves between those three sides. And the thing about double agents is that eventually you have to ask, who are they actually loyal to? Or are they loyal to anyone? Alexandra could genuinely be working for Ukraine and still be manipulating the Americans. She could genuinely be inside Russian intelligence and still have her own agenda. She doesn't have to be a cartoon villain for any of this to work. She just has to want something different from what Joe wants. She could also be set up herself. So who is actually the spider that the first episode title refers to? And this is where the title from episode 1 is still hanging over the season for me. All right, the spider and the fly. Who is who? At first, you might think that Yurimov is the spider. You know, Joe's the fly. Joe comes to capture him and ends up getting pulled into something bigger. But what if Alexandra is the spider? Yeah, she provides the intelligence, she gets the Americans moving, and she puts Joe onto the battlefield, she connects everybody together, and Joe thinks she's going after Yurimov. But maybe she's actually walking into Alexandra's web, or whoever controls Alexandra. There's also another possibility. Maybe Joe herself is the bait. Maybe somebody wants the CIA to react around her, which leads back to the attack on the house. Was the house attack actually a test? This is probably my favorite theory at the moment. So what if the two men at Joe's house were never expected to succeed? You know, they didn't seem very well trained. Think about what happens after they attack. Joe activates the response, the QRF deploys, the neighborhood gets swept, and the CIA procedures kick in. The family gets moved, people begin communicating, different agencies become involved, new security arrangements are put in place, and if you're watching all of that, you just learn an enormous amount. You've discovered how quickly the Americans respond, or Joe's team responds. You've discovered who responds, what tactics they use, where Joe's family gets moved, and potentially which people are responsible for protecting her. Then fast forward 6 months, a much bigger, much more organized team comes for Joe. And this time, they succeed. That could be because the first attack taught them exactly what they needed to know. The first attack wasn't the mission. It was recon. Cruz. We also get some time away from Joe with Cruz. And I think Cruz is being positioned for something much bigger this season. Look at how far she's come since season 1. Originally, she was the asset. Joe pushed her into these situations. Joe controlled almost every part of the mission. Now Cruz is an experienced operator in her own right. She doesn't need Joe holding her hand, and we already know that 6 months from now, Joe is taken off the road. So who fills that gap? I think Cruz could end up carrying a lot more responsibility later in the season, and I wouldn't be surprised if Joe's disappearance eventually becomes personal for her, because their relationship has completely changed. There's history there now, respect, and probably a lot of unresolved baggage as well. We also get more of Cruz and Josie, and I actually think these scenes are useful because this episode's pretty bleak. Joe's family is under threat, there are foreign operatives inside the country, and everybody is trying to work out how badly the CIA has been penetrated. So having the quieter interactions gives this episode some breathing room. But I also don't think that they're just there for a bit of a relationship drama. Josie could become important again, and Cruz is clearly becoming one of the major characters in the series rather than simply being someone attached to Joe's storyline. So I'm keeping an eye on where that goes. Then we get the scene that, for me, is probably the emotional center of the entire episode, Joe and Neil. Joe finally cracks. This isn't angry Joe, it's not operational Joe. This isn't just Joe threatening somebody or trying to take control. She basically has got nothing left, because for once, the consequences of her work are sitting directly in front of her. Her husband and her children and their home. And she apologizes, and it's genuine, and it's really, really important, because Joe has always been able to justify what she does by telling herself that it protects people. It protects the country, it protects her family, but now her family is in danger because of what she does. That's a hard thing for somebody like Joe to accept. And Neil can't just pretend this is another difficult day at work. His children have been displaced because armed men came looking for his wife, and that changes the marriage. It has to. Even if he still loves her, even if he understands why she does the job, you can't unsee that. And that brings us to the title, No Sorrow Like the Survivor. Joe survives. That's what she does. She survives operations. She survives being shot. She survives missions that go completely wrong. She survives situations that kill other people. But surviving doesn't mean escaping the consequences. And I think that that's what this episode is really about. Joe keeps surviving. But every time she does, she carries more of it home with her. And now the people she loves are starting to carry it as well. That might be the real cost of Joe's life. Not dying, living with everything that happens because she survived. What I thought of episode 2. So I thought this was a really, really strong follow-up to the premiere. Episode 1 had the big Ukraine sequence, the dogs, the drones, the trench fighting, the capture of Yurimov. It was all there. Episode 2 doesn't try and top that. Instead, it deals with the consequences. And I actually think that that was the right decision. The action comes home, the intelligence mystery gets bigger, and most importantly, the scenes aren't necessarily the ones with the guns. It's Byron sitting across from the Russians. It's Neil trying to process what has just happened to his family. And it's Joe finally realizing that she may not be able to keep these two parts of her life separate anymore. And that worked for me. All right, so updated theories. I still think Yurimov may have wanted to be captured, or at least somebody wanted the CIA to capture him. He may be delivering false intel, he may be trying to identify the American assets, and he may be trying to escape something inside Russia. Or he may simply be one piece of a much larger operation. But the whole thing still feels too convenient. Is that even Yurimov? All right, theory 2. Alexandra is not simply a double agent. She might be playing all three sides, Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, but that doesn't necessarily mean that she's loyal to nobody. She may have a very specific objective. We just don't know what that is yet. But she's currently the person who appears to connect the entire story, and that makes her extremely dangerous. All right, theory 3, the kidnapping is not revenge. And this is the one I'm becoming increasingly convinced about. Joe's eventual kidnapping is not simply revenge. If somebody wanted revenge, kill her. It's simple. All right, instead they take her alive. So there has to be another purpose. Information, leverage, access, or maybe they just need Joe to cooperate with something. That's why I think we should pay close attention to what Joe learns over the next few episodes. Because whatever she discovers may explain why she's worth taking alive 6 months later. Theory 4. All right, there's still a leak, and I'm not ruling out an internal leak. All right, the level of information somebody has about Joe is extraordinary. All right, they know her identity, they know her home, they know her family, and her movements. All right, eventually her routine, and that information has come from somewhere. Long-term surveillance could explain part of it, but I still think there's a possibility that someone inside the American system is feeding information out. And if that's true, the whole Russia angle could potentially be a distraction. I keep coming back to it. Is Caitlyn's husband involved somehow? Is he involved? There's something there that just doesn't sit right with me about that guy. All right, Joe is being studied. So theory 5, that's another possibility. What if the objective isn't simply to find Joe? What if somebody is studying how she responds? The house attack, the surveillance, the way her security changes, and the kidnapping. Maybe somebody is systematically learning Joe, her habits, her weaknesses, her relationships, and how she reacts under pressure. Because if you understand Joe McNamara well enough, you may not need to physically force her to do anything. All right, you threaten Neil, you threaten the girls, and suddenly one of the CIA's most experienced operators becomes leverage. And that could be where this is going. Okay, that takes me to the final thoughts. So after episode 2, I think the mystery is actually getting bigger. We still don't really know who controls the operation. All right, so Yurimov may have been bait, Alexandra may have been manipulating multiple sides, and there could still be a leak inside the American system. Caitlyn's husband, right? And the attack on Joe's house may have been less about killing her and more about seeing what happened next. But the biggest clue remains the opening timeline. 6 months from now, Joe is taken alive, and that means somebody needs something from her. What is it? So the question I'm going into episode 3 with is no longer who wants Joe dead. All right, the question is who needs Joe alive and what do they need from her? Let me know what you guys think. Do you trust Alexandra? Do you think Yurimov deliberately allowed himself to be captured? And was the attack on Joe's house actually a reconnaissance operation? Right, who do you think's behind the kidnapping? Like me, do you think Caitlyn's husband is involved? Is it the Russians? Is it the Ukrainians? Is it somebody else that we're not thinking about here? Drop your theories in the comments down below. All right, if you enjoyed the video, give us a like, a subscribe, all right? And I'll be back after episode 3. You can find us on all the major podcasting platforms, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, obviously on YouTube, iHeartRadio, and a whole bunch of others. Keep watching, share it to your friends. Thanks for watching.